All right, well, if everybody's relatively settled in, why don't we start? I'm Lawrence Pintack. I'm the Dean of the Edward R. Murrow College of Communication here at WSU. I see some of our students here, and I presume a lot of the others are poli-sci students. Welcome to all of you. I know some of the comm students need to slip out at some point. That's fine. I acknowledge that you need to leave. We know you're not being rude, so that's cool. Let me introduce our panelists today. From the end, Rod Hart is one of my colleagues. Rod is Dean of the College of Communication at UT Austin, and he's the Alan Shivers Centennial Chair in Communication and Government. How do you fit that on the card? At UT, obviously, and his areas of special interest are politics and mass media. Patricia Moy, next to me here, is the Christy Cressy Professor of Communication and Adjunct Faculty in Political Science at that other university in Washington. Her interests are political communication, political opinion, and communication theory. And finally, Tim Groeling is an Assistant Professor of Communication Studies at UCLA. Associate. Oh, I must have looked at an old CV. I beg your forgiveness. Associate Professor in Comm Studies at UCLA. His research interests include political communication and new media. Each of the panelists is going to give a little presentation, and then we'll throw some questions around. Tim, could you start for us?
I want to talk today about some of the things I think are especially interesting about this race compared to some previous ones, and to talk about some things that I think are a little bit strange. 2009, if you're looking at the initial period of 2009 with President Obama coming to office, Democrats successfully routing Republicans in 2008 in a relatively historic victory. There were a lot of reasons in 2009 to think that this was going to be a Democratic century, a Democratic dominant period. You had an extremely popular president during that time period. He had roughly 2/3 of Americans approving of his job in office almost from the beginning. You had a party in the Democrats that were trusted more than Republicans on almost every major issue, including ones Republicans had owned in the past, like taxation or deficit spending. You have a weakened and divided Republican Party during this time period. So Republicans were basically very divided. They were dealing with internal strife and conflict, and also there's a bit of a blame game as to who should be held responsible, which strategy would pull them forward in the future. And not clear about what that should be, whether or not they should moderate, whether or not they should stick to core principles. A very sort of divided opposing party. There was strong public support for change. There was, in fact, one of the strongest levels of public support for change in government that we had seen in recent polls. And supermajority in the Senate, which is, if you're a political scientist, of course it was there, it was gone, it was there, it was gone. But having a supermajority in the Senate makes your life so much easier if you can invoke cloture. And plus, they were also starting off with the main problem facing the country being one that was squarely in the lap of their predecessor, George W. Bush and his administration. Basically, less than 2 years later, it's been a reversal of fortune. The Democratic problems in 2010 sort of correspond nicely to what their benefits were a few years ago. Now, Obama is, I think, officially unpopular. You can say that when his disapproval is equivalent to or above his approval, which is the level he currently is at, especially among likely voters. He is, I think, regarded as being unpopular. The Democratic Party is now not just trusted less on their traditional issues of distrust, but also on a wide variety of issues that they used to own. Again, in 2 short years, the public has shifted almost completely regarding which party they trust more on a series of issues across the board. The Republicans are actually very united currently, appear to be surging, and in fact you have likely voters, them representing one of the highest proportions of likely voters of any voting population in recent midterm elections. Strong public condemnation of some of the Democrats' signature policies, like the health care reform bill and also the stimulus. And frankly, they'll likely not just have lost their supermajority in the Senate, but also probably will lose control of the House and vaguely, potentially, the Senate. And the party is basically held more accountable for having to deal with issues and has poor approval in handling the economy and other issues. So what explains this rather large change? I'll be talking about, went one slide too far, talking about politics in a way to help us understand these things, both in terms of what the impact of new media might be, but also some traditional factors that I think come into play. One of which I think is, paradoxically, the fact that the Democrats got control of Congress and achieved unified government in 2008's election was something that if they had to do over again, they might not have wanted to have done. Presidential power, I think, is also more limited now in its ability to move public opinion than it might previously have been. So the ability of Obama to win over his opponents is more limited than a president might have been able to do in the 1980s or another era. And I think that there's new technology that is allowing his opponents to organize more effectively against him. Okay, unified government, part of the story I think is important is that it's a very different world that Obama is facing under unified government than he potentially will face in divided government just a little while from now. Political scientists tend to assume that if you're running as a party, you want to get as much power as possible. You want to gain control of as many levers of government as possible. And I actually argue that unified government is, at least in the current environment, one that ends up biting you in a body part. I just won't say it out loud. It tends to produce some things that are bad for your party. It tends to undermine your party's brand name and its cohesion. It tends to unite your opposing party disproportionately. And it tends to, more importantly, make your party responsible for everything. And being responsible for everything is potentially very bad. Let me just do a quick thought experiment. Imagine, if you will, that the Gulf oil spill happened when the Republicans were in control of Congress, or at least one party, one chamber in Congress. Imagine how news media coverage would have differed, and how the public debate and discussion over the oil spill and its handling and its competence of the handling and the root causes of it would have varied if there was a Republican legislature that was also sharing power with Obama during that time period. The oil spill is tremendously damaging. I mean, there has been discussion, I think, of it being the equivalent of Obama's Katrina in terms of undermining the public's perception of his competence to handle major issues. And if that had been an instance where Republicans would have been equally culpable and equally responsible for the handling of the crisis, at least in terms of the necessity to resolve it, I think he would have fared politically much better. If the economy currently, which is going poorly, was a situation where Obama was sharing responsibility for that with the Republican Congress, I think, again, his standing would be relatively higher than it is currently. Because divided government is, first and foremost, an ironclad alibi for failure. You can always point to the opposing side in divided government and credibly tell your supporters it's those guys over there that are responsible, and avoid some of the consequences of that action. That's actually not good for democracy, and that's one of the reasons why political scientists tend not to like it. But if you're one of the politicians in office who gets to point the finger at someone else, that's very good for you and very good for your party. So fighting the common enemy turns out to be a very effective way to rally your party together. Parties like two types of stories. They like stories in which their party is praised, and they like stories in which the opposing party is attacked. If you are basically looking as a partisan of a type of story that you want to encourage, those are the two you want. They hate stories in which their members are criticized or the other party is praised. The problem is, in unified government, the other party isn't in power, so you cannot generally credibly criticize those members and have it be a newsworthy enough story to get coverage. What is newsworthy is your own members criticizing your party or the other party criticizing you because you're in power. So it's basically very difficult without a credible opponent for you to unify what your party's for. And typically parties do that in modern politics by criticizing the other party. That's what they call it politics as usual, is because that's a very effective strategy for them to deal with it. If you might have paid attention a few weeks ago, you saw President Obama making a fairly big deal in criticizing John Boehner for the first time in his speeches. He actually started shifting, talking about former President Bush as much in his speeches, and started talking about John Boehner. And one of the problems with that currently, and I don't know if you can read it in that tiny, tiny text, is it's like John Boehner, pronounced Boehner is what the story says, the AP Wire Service story, is that people typically don't know who John Boehner is, in part because he's out of power. He is in the House of Representatives in the minority. The House of Representatives minority has exceptionally little power to do anything except complain about the majority party and the president, so he was in fact not a credible target to unite party rhetoric around. Now, after next week, that will change, and you'll start seeing the tanned, smiling visage of John Boehner every single day on your TVs, which you have to look forward to. That's going to be fun for you. Republicans had a much easier job. Republicans basically had much more freedom to pick their stances. They actually couldn't talk as much about themselves, but as it turns out, because of the underlying divisions they had within the party, that's fine. That means that those divisions are less salient, less covered. They can praise or criticize Democrats. Either one of those is newsworthy. because the Democrats are in power. So if the Republicans praise the Democrats, that's unusual enough to get coverage. If they criticize the Democrats, that's conflict and also important because they're the designated responders. They don't actually also have to offer alternatives when they're in the minority party. On health care reform, what was the Republican alternative plan that was discussed in great detail? They barely did a plan. I mean, they just did enough of a plan so they could say, we did a plan, we're not going to talk about it, leave us alone. In fairness, when George W. Bush was trying to reform Social Security under the Democrats, they did exactly the same thing, which is we don't have to give a plan, we just have to say that yours is terrible and we hate it, and there. So that's a very effective way to unify a party, because basically almost any position that isn't the Democratic position, is one in which the party can unite around. They can each be going with actually completely diametrically opposed preferences as to what they want the true policy to be, as long as it's not the Democratic Party position, and then they're able to go forward and be unified in that. And to transition to my next point, they were aided in this task by the fact that there are increasingly partisan news media outlets that are out there that would take their message forward and be able to deliver it, especially to their supporters. So transitioning a little bit to talk about new media, which is one of the main topics for today. Looking at this, you can see that if you're looking at the internet, and by the way, this chart actually understates the influence of new media with time, because TV includes different media. But looking at internet going from 6% of the population getting most of their national and international news from it in 1999, you see that now it's actually past newspapers, and not just past newspapers, but is almost very shortly double the level of news people are getting from newspapers. TV contains things like cable news, which itself is a form of new media. If we break that down by age group to get a sense of where this is going to go over time, this is actually from last year, not this year. But you can see if you look at the 18 to 29-year-olds and compare them to the 65-plus crowd, both groups watch a fair amount of television. And by the way, these numbers, you're allowed to choose more than one response. That's why they don't add up to 100%. You can see that the internet is now very close to challenging TV as the main source of national and international news. In fact, I think in the more recent data that I looked at just before the conference but couldn't put in a chart, for the 18 to 29-year-olds, it's basically right there with TV. You see that newspapers are basically what is getting squeezed out. And if you look at the 65-plus crowd, they use newspapers like your generation uses the internet. So there's been a substitution into internet forms of news. Looking at the sort of flagship way in which the public typically learned about politics, the evening news programs on the three major networks, they have dropped like a stone in terms of the numbers of viewers who are actually attending to them with time. In 1980, they actually had far more than double the ratings, more than double the viewers on a nightly basis than they do now. So even though this is a much larger country, a larger population, the evening news broadcasts are being watched by far fewer. You see that actually, if I were to continue this chart to the present day, it would extend below the baseline of that chart, because it's only 24 million or so watch it on a good week today. Of course, the elephant in the room is Fox News. Fox News has been a major player in 2010, just as they were a major player in 2008. It's been interesting to see that in the quest to find a credible opponent to unite his party around, actually Obama, in addition to using former President Bush and Rush Limbaugh, has been waging a relatively public war against Fox to try to fill that role and unite his party around that. That has been reacted to negatively by other media organizations who regard it as a potential affront to freedom of the press, and hasn't, I don't think, been terribly successful. But through things like Glenn Beck's rally and through its constant coverage, it does actually seem to be as influential in leading the opposition as Republicans in Congress have been, at least in reaching the broader public. It has massive credibility and reach among conservatives especially. I'll talk about the self-selected audience in a moment. It's a constant stream of oppositional voices. In contrast, the traditional news media's credibility is at a low ebb, historically speaking. Looking at a partisan breakdown of credibility across different news organizations, there's been a secular trend over the last few decades. Overall, the public is much less likely to trust all or most what they see on any of the traditional news media outlets. But if you're looking at Republicans in particular, they don't trust most of the news media outlets that are out there. it's an extremely small number. In contrast, the Democrats don't trust what they see on Fox. The highest percentage of Democrat trust is in CNN. The highest Republican is for Fox. Interestingly, you see that only 21% of Democrats trust Fox, but that number is higher than the percentage of Republicans who trust all or most of what they see on CNN, ABC, NBC, CBS. I mean, so in effect, it's a very polarized marketplace in terms of what they believe and increasingly in terms of what they consume. You see that Republicans are now far more likely to consume Fox than any other alternative medium, whereas back in 2000, Republicans were more likely to watch CNN than Fox. You actually looked at MSNBC. I'm sorry, I meant, yeah, that's right. You see that CNN, you actually have more Republicans proportionally watching it in 2002 than you did Democrats, and now there's been a lot of self-sorting. So this sort of self-sorting is making it more difficult for Obama to reach people that he needs to change the mind of, his critics. It is increasingly easy for people to reach their supporters. I want to highlight, if you haven't seen it, really quickly, something that was innovative in 2008 that I think is the future of a lot of this communication that's going to be taking place. This is Obama's iPhone application that he used in 2008. How many of you have seen this before? I mean, presumably some of you downloaded and used it. I think this is something that's a mark of using technology to cheaply, directly communicate and with supporters, and also use those supporters to invest their own credibility and networks into your efforts going forward. If you haven't seen this application, one of the interesting things about it was that it encouraged you to call your friends in battleground states. It would actually go through and say, what we want to do is look at your address book, and we're not going to steal this information from you, we're just going to organize it for you. And then we will prioritize everyone on your address book as to whether or not they are in a battleground state or not. And these are the ones we care most about. And we want you to call these people first. And it'll keep track of whether or not you did or didn't and give you basically social incentives for doing so. Just so we're clear, when you're calling these other people, you're acting and investing your own credibility and your own network benefits into that sort of communication. I'm running a little behind, so I'm going to blow through this more quickly. You can get direct communication. You can find out news events and have it customized. It knows where you are and can let you know when there's things happening nearby. And this is something I think is particularly interesting. On all these different issues, when you're going forward as a representative of this organization and presenting their views, you don't just get to make stuff up that might be inconsistent with their actual views. They actually will have talking points done up for you to make sure that you're saying exactly what the party wants you to say or the candidate wants you to say and representing them, but then putting your own sort of credibility behind it. That sort of distributed method of communicating a carefully coordinated message is new and interesting and different in a way that I think is kind of cool. I'll just sort of close a little bit with the Tea Party and its organization. I assigned my students in a class this quarter to read Olson's Logic of Collective Action, which is a classic text that talks about why it's difficult for interest groups to form and why it's so hard for potential interests that need to be represented out in the general public to get their views represented through social action or collective action. And the main purpose of me assigning this is that when you read this sort of text carefully, which is a landmark piece of work in this area, how much of this work is driven by outdated cost assumptions and outdated assumptions of how benefits can be distributed. There are a lot of things in the new technology that's available to groups like the Tea Party that allow them to find other potential members cheaply, that allow them to have a flat distributional and coordinational model instead of a hierarchical one with very little bureaucracy, very little sort of costs associated with doing so, and reward their members socially instead of having to have there be some sort of selective incentives like one would normally have. Monitoring the action and working together in this sort of organization is far easier than it has traditionally been, and I think that's also a model of how groups are going to function in the future. So I want to stop there and pass the laptop over.
Patricia?
Thank you. Well, as you saw from the flyer that was distributed, one of the key questions to this forum is, what does it mean to have democracy nowadays? What is democracy, and has it moved online? Well, sure enough, I would say that popular discourse and a growing body of literature would say resoundingly, yes, democracy has moved online. My response is a little bit more tempered and would sound like a chorus of voices in a large lecture hall. Yes, no, it depends. And so that's what I'm talking about. Democracy online, yes, no, it depends. Let me start off with the yes and it depends part. And here I mean it depends on what it means when we define democracy. What does it mean to define citizenship, and what does it mean to be a good citizen? I think if we were to think about citizenship in the good old days, before the internet, before new media technology, we would think about electoral politics and electoral participation as including donations, campaigning, going out and rallying, sending around petitions. Sure enough, those still exist, and we can't deny the existence of their online counterparts nowadays. But we also need to realize that new media have brought the elites and the public much closer together, and they facilitate the vertical communication that occurs. Citizens nowadays think that, unlike their grandparents years and years ago, that distance to the elites is not this great, but it's only this far. Think about what we do. How easy is it for us to post a blog, to comment on a blog, to press like on our Facebook accounts, your Facebook accounts, I don't have one, to create what we hope might be a viral video. Think about all the things that we do and how easy it is for us to think we are much more efficacious. There's a lot of evidence out there that shows that the people who are engaged in e-politics tend to be more efficacious, and they feel they can make a difference. So online media, web-based media, get a big, healthy check mark on that front if we were to define citizenship this way. But we also know that defining and practicing citizenship also means that we need to find out how people understand issues. Do they have an enlightened understanding of issues? Well, in today's highly balkanized media landscape, it's easy to say that we can access information of all stripes. Thank you. But to what extent are we interested as citizens in getting information that is different from how we feel? If you think about the blogs we turn to, there are, I couldn't even tell you how many blogs, millions of blogs. How many of them do we read? And of those that we read, how many of them affirm our own ideologies and what we believe? Yes, I'm sure there are many of us who turn to blogs just to, quote unquote, get information that we could use in an argument against our friends who feel very differently from us. But think about Twitter. Are you really willing to read messages, even 140 characters long, from someone who feels very differently from you, and it's all messages, they're all messages that differ from how you personally feel? So again, if we think about an enlightened understanding of issues as a key component of citizenship, we need to say, yes, the media do help us, online media help us, web-based media help us, there is potential access to full information, there is potential diversity of thought, but that potential is not fully realized. If you think about the people with whom we discuss politics, we think it would be fantastic if we received all this information, information that is very similar to how we think, information that may differ from how we think, and information that is completely different from how we think. But we don't. Most political information takes place with comfortably homogeneous others. Birds of a feather tend to flock together. Likes hang with likes. My peeps think like me. So if you think about how people discuss politics, interpersonal discussion is what happens. We get political information, but are we getting different political information? Do we have this enlightened understanding? So if the answer is, do we have access to it? Yes, web-based media would get a check plus, but do we actually access it? And here the jury is out. We think about enlightened understanding of issues as coming from diverse groups, and we think that's great. But we also know from some research conducted by a political scientist at Harvard, Robert Putnam, that diversity may not be so great. In a 2007 lecture that he gave, and was published in 2007, it was called E Pluribus Unum, Diversity and Community in the 21st Century. Putnam outlines all of the ills that diversity can bring into a community. He says it fosters distrust, apathy, social withdrawal. It agitates for social reform. People who live in communities that are highly diverse tend to have less social capital. And at one point he writes, diversity, at least in the short run, seems to bring out the turtle in all of us. So we are around different people unlike ourselves, and we tend to withdraw. Obviously, he doesn't end there. And instead, what he does is he calls for this revisiting of what it means to be an American and what it means to belong to a community. So if we were to think about web-based media as something that helps democratic politics, we would say, yes, web-based media would get a check plus for encouraging and fostering a sense of community outside our immediate life space. We get to interact with others based on some avocational interest. We get to interact with others who do not live near us based on political interests. We get to identify with these people. There's this touchy-feely, e-feely sense, and we get to mobilize. And so web-based media do help us in that respect. But then again, there's a dark side to all of this. The level of political discourse that takes place nowadays, particularly in the last few years, has grown increasingly uncivil, and in that ether space, it runs unfettered. It runs rampant, and who stops it? Is there an FCC that would say, you know what, you can't say that on your blog? What's going to happen? If you were to think about the insular talk in which citizens engage, the talk that we do with the friends who think like us, and we think about how it ramps up in levels of incivility, think about what happens in the larger domain. We become microclimates of polarized, uncivil talk. And at that point, we start talking past each other. So there is that dark side. Now, obviously, when I talk about the role of web-based media and my views on it, I don't mean to say that all web-based media are the same. Obviously, there are blogs, there are videos, there are Twitter feeds that are very different, so I don't mean to suggest that they are a singular entity or a unitary phenomenon. Let me move to elaborating on the no side. Remember, I started out with yes, no, it depends, and I did the yes, it depends. Well, let's do the no, it depends. And that's no, democracy has not moved online, at least not fully. In terms of electoral politics, let me make 2 points. One is that old media matter, and second is that the quote-unquote newer media that matter aren't necessarily new media technologies. National level political campaigning that we've seen this week illustrates that. Barack Obama has been trying to garner support for various Democratic candidates in this midterm election, and this week alone he's done a number of radio interviews. He's gone on Michael Smerconish's talk radio show. He's gone on Al Sharpton's talk radio show. He's used a tried and true medium that will reach millions of viewers live and will reach even more millions later on through web-based media. And of course, Obama, as many of you know, is the first sitting president to actually have gone on The Daily Show. And this particular move is something that many politicians have tried to make in jumping on the pop goes politics bandwagon. And this is what I mean by newer media mattering. What I want to do is to talk about late night comedy. And the data that I'll be discussing, not necessarily with any numbers, they come from national data sets, national surveys, as well as some experiments. And I wanted to show you, first of all, who watches late night comedy in general. These are younger males who have lower levels of education, they're not married, they're not employed full-time, they've spent less time at their current residence, they're liberal, and they're politically interested. So just keep this slide in mind and that information. Late night comedy, infotainment tends to attract a certain type of audience member. The people who watch late night comedy also tend to watch local TV news. We suspect it's because they don't, that button to change the channel on the remote may be broken. You watch local TV news at night and you stay on to watch late night comedy. They're also listening to political talk radio, and they're using the internet for political information. So not necessarily individuals who are reading newspapers or television. So this is the landscape, this is the backdrop. Let's turn to the effects of watching late night comedy. The first effect that we've documented, and not just me and my co-authors, but many others, is that if you tend to watch late night comedy, you will actually have changes in how you perceive candidates. George W. Bush went on to the Letterman show on October 19th, 2000. David Letterman that year joked, "The road to the White House runs through me." It's possible. Jon Stewart thinks that as well, but we tend to think now, and we tend to recognize that these folks are not insignificant players. Well, what you see here are very interesting patterns. So what you see in each of these bars is the difference between people who view late night comedy and those who don't. And so if you think about people who view late night comedy, they're liberal. The people who are liberal tend to be thinking very favorably about Gore. He's the striped line. And in the 3 weeks before the appearance of George W. Bush on Letterman, positive ratings, still positive ratings of Gore afterwards. Bush, in the 3 weeks before he shows up on Letterman, he doesn't get his ratings aren't that favorable. But notice the week after he appears on Letterman, his ratings go up. And so, at least in the short term, George W. Bush's appearance on Letterman increased his approval ratings among people who would be predisposed against feeling favorably towards him. And so what we see is this change. We also see a change in how viewers evaluate the candidates. It turns out, I'm going to show you a slide, but we'll forget about that. Basically, the people who saw George W. Bush on Letterman tended to perceive him as more caring during that than people who didn't see him. And so if you saw him as more caring, you tended to think of him more favorably. So we went back and we looked at the tapes, because back then it was tapes, and we tried to figure out, why are people thinking about George Bush as caring? Because all of the issues that Letterman talked about were serious issues. They were talking about the death penalty, the Yemen bombing. They also talked about George W. Bush and how he had that open mic gaffe when he called Adam Clymer a part of an anatomy, the back part. And it turns out that he is seen as standing up for his friend. Bush responds to Letterman, he says, "Well, he insulted my friend and I stood up for him. Wouldn't you stand up for your friend?" And regarding the bombing in Yemen, he says, "Well, you know, you have to show people that you can't mess with Americans." And each one of these statements is met with warm applause. Okay, so we have effects of watching late night comedy also leads to increased campaign participation. You tend to be more active in the campaign. You tend to vote more, or you are more likely to vote. Unfortunately, this is a finding that is only found among those who already know more about politics. So it's not among people who don't know much about politics, but the people who know more and watch late night comedy with its political spin will tend to vote more often or more likely. The same thing with increased political discussion. If you watch late night comedy and an infotainment, you will tend to discuss politics more, but the likelihood of speaking more about politics is greater among those who know more about politics to begin with. And this would make sense. If you think about the jokes that we hear on Letterman, Leno, or Stewart, they're funny only because we understand what the reality is. Jokes are not funny if you go to another country and you don't understand the politics. Jokes are funny only because we understand the discrepancy between the punchline and what reality is. We also have one final effect of watching late night comedy or infotainment, and that has to do with how people process information. You might think, hey, Rush Limbaugh has 20 million listeners, 20 million followers. Jon Stewart has millions and millions of people, so of course they must be having some effect. But it turns out that the people who are listening, the people who are watching, are pretty much processing that information that they get through their own political lens. A couple of years ago, we conducted an experiment with Nancy Pelosi and what she was doing as Speaker of the House. You'll recall that she became Speaker of the House in 2006, had very favorable ratings, and in 2007 her ratings declined, partly due to what was going on in Iraq. Well, we conducted an experiment in which student subjects were shown either a hard news clip criticizing Pelosi and what she was doing, or they were exposed to a clip of more lighthearted fare in which Jon Stewart lambasted her, and there were some Dance Dance Revolution clips. And it turns out that afterwards, the one that you see, the dark line that goes downwards, is how Democrats felt about Pelosi. After watching the video clip of Stewart being anti-Pelosi, their feelings towards her cooled considerably. But Republicans went up in their estimation. And we interpret this as a way of, as subjects, thinking about Jon Stewart as their friend. You're interacting parasocially with him, you're laughing with him, you're joking with him, even though he exists only on that screen. And so Democrats think, an enemy of my friend is my enemy, hence the downward trend. Republicans think, here's my enemy, Jon Stewart, because he's liberal, and an enemy of my enemy is my friend, upward. So in the end, what we have is good news with infotainment. Hey, you've got great campaign participation and political discussion, but the not so good news is that it may not be the great equalizer that television was thought to be in the 1960s and early 1970s, in that it's the people who are already sophisticated about politics who are advantaged by this. It's helping those folks, not everyone. So, thank you.
Thank you. Dean Hart?
You've been hearing two really wonderful scholars that have presenting a lot of fact-based information. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to present opinion. The only reason for you to believe anything I say is that you're people of deep moral value. And if you are those kind of people, then I hope you'll pay attention. I want to show a video clip.
As you know, we talk a lot on this program about how Congress can be somewhat ineffectual or short-sighted or ignorant or a fetid pool of corruption and stupidity located at the intersection of Entitlement Avenue and abject dereliction of duty lane. I'm sorry, what are we talking about again? Congress. All right.
And so it came to pass that democracy had run its course. It had been a good run, but Congress and the courts instead opted for a new system, one that affectionately came to be known as cashocracy. This clever new system was particularly beneficial for fellows like Jasper P. Hucksteroo and his platform of turning up, down, and down, up. With Jasper's new cashocratic rights, he could benefit from unlimited funding provided by nobody knows. Because in a cashocracy, the money behind the politics remains wonderfully hidden, thanks to a glorious combination of numbers and letters and pleasant-sounding names. Better still, Jasper's candidacy of up is down, down is upism received a tremendous boost when corporations were declared real live boys who could contribute endless millions. With corporations now people and people now hidden, the fruits of cashocracy really rolled in. But Jasper wanted complete cashocratic success, so he used part of his own personal hucksteroo fortune to fund his campaign, just like other bazillionaire candidates. Up is down, down is upism gained in popularity. Political consulting firms gained in profits, and Jasper's cashocratic success had arrived. Cashocracy. taking the guesswork out of democracy $1 million at a time.
Okay, so let's get together a segment, and it would be notable political quotes from the past, other candidates, other administrations, other notable political quotes. Take a look. I hope you enjoy it.
Christine O'Donnell, I'm not a witch. Richard Nixon, I'm not a crook. George W. Bush, I'm not allowed to use the stove by myself.
Get that.
Come get around, get condit, scooter and road. It's time to get packing. We must hit the road, but there's war and recession and bad mortgage loans.
And our legacy needs saving.
So forget he's a jackass who's liberally prone. Oh, it's time for some campaigning.
Old party friends, time to say au revoir. We failed to extinguish Barack's rising star.
You were so close, my darling. Alas, no surrender.
I'll be back in 4 years, heck, it ain't all that far.
Oh, it's time for some campaigning. Gather conservatives, lend me a hand. Unless you want this like robots and command types and years in a rat hole in North Vietnam. Now the GOP's contending.
I'm so tired of divisive exchange, and I got one or two things to say about change, like the change we must change to the change we hold here. I really like change, and I made myself clear.
So we'll talk about change till you're deaf in the ear. Oh, it's time for some campaigning.
Citizens gather from both far and near for a ritual we practice every 4 years, when we promise you anything you wanna hear. To win the competition, we spend billions of dollars to make our points clear, to get you to step up and cast your vote here. Then we spin you around and poke you in the rear. Oh, it's time for some campaigning. Yes, it's time for some campaigning.
We live in an age of political cynicism, and I think we argue that we don't like cynicism, but I think we do. I think our cynicisms are crushing our spirit as a people. I think that's not good, and I think to understand why cynicism exists, we have to understand why it's attractive. Now, there's a lot of good things about political humor. It releases tension, helps us deal with life tragedies. It teases out truths. Satire has been a weapon for centuries. It afflicts the comfortable. It flattens the hierarchy of society. It makes people who are really important seem less important by making fun of them. And that's been true from Ben Franklin through George Carlin. And it inspires creativity. It makes people think new thoughts because people laugh about things. I don't have a lot of time to do research these days, but I did a study recently. Actually, it was Tuesday, and it only took about 10 minutes. But I'm a dean, and that's not bad, you know. All right, so I went to Google, and I put in sources of hope in quotation marks, and you can duplicate the study. Research is not that hard, no matter what they say. Sources of hope and then I put in these words, education, sources of hope and education, 137,000 hits. Sources of hope and work, 82,000. God, 49,700. Family, 47,100. Friends, 33,800. Doctors, 29,500. Music, 22,900. Travel, 16,200. Philosophy, 14,800. Source of hope. Psychiatry, 12,800. 2,000 under philosophy. Drugs, 11,800. 1,000 under psychiatry. Entertainment, 10,200. Dogs, 9,830. Poetry, 9,080. Fish, 8,400. I just threw fish in. Football, 7,200. Alcohol, 6,780. Cats, 5,850. Much less than dogs. Humor, 5,700. Politicians, 5,370. Politicians are over 3,000 less than fish. So I went looking for things that were lower than politician. I put in hammocks, source of hope, layout 203, and gerbils 199. So what is it that makes it so attractive to laugh about politics? Why does it feel good to feel bad about politics? That's my question. And I want to give you some quick answers to that. One, cynicism is a language. It's something we teach. No child is born cynical. You go to any 2-year-old and you say, what do you think about this guy, Obama? They'll say, got candy? I mean, that's what a 2-year-old, they're not born cynical. We teach one another how to be cynical. And cynical is a language that we practice and perfect. It's contagious. There are no cynics on an island. If you lived on a desert island, you would not be cynical. Cynicism requires other people to be part of the story. You have to talk to other people and say, like, this is really lousy, don't you think? Don't you think? And they say, yeah. You say, yeah, I knew you thought it was really lousy too. So there's an instability to cynicism, so we have to keep duplicating it for one another. It's fragile. It's an unnatural condition, and so we have to keep moving it forward. It's also destabilizing. Peter Sloterdijk, a historian, looked at Weimar Germany. This is Germany before Hitler. And it was a very tough time in Germany economically and culturally and socially. And Sloterdijk says the expectation of being deceived had become a universal state of consciousness in Weimar Germany. And what that meant was they believed in nothing. And so that opened the door to believe in one thing. And guess what that one thing was? So given the nature of cynicism and its difficulties, why would it be attractive? Let me give you some reasons. It's a kind of communal coinage. I started an honors program at my college some years ago, and in the first day of the class, 30 students in the symposium for the honors course, we sat around in a circle and people would introduce themselves. Then at the end of the semester, I asked the students to write a paper reflecting on their experiences in the course. Take something that came up in the course that you paid attention to. And the student wrote an essay based on the first day of class. And she wrote a sentence which I wrote down and still have. And she was sitting there and she was saying, I was scared on the first day because I didn't have anything cynical to say. Now this is a 19-year-old on the first day of class worrying that when it got down to her and she was person 26, that she wasn't going to be able to top the other students in the class and say the thing that she knew had to be said, which was cynical. But it makes community, a perverse community, I suggest, but a community. It's media sanctioned. You can see that. It's on TV. They talk that way. I want to be cool. How many of you like Jon Stewart? You ought to be ashamed of yourself. Right? But it's hard to resist because it's Jon Stewart. Study done a few years ago by Mark Hetherington came up with this, and it's a very social science-y conclusion. He said this: voters' personal experience with the economy were less than twice as important as media consumption in explaining their economics assessments. I know you don't understand. I'm going to say it again. Voters' personal experiences with the economy were less than twice as important as media consumption in explaining economic assessments. What he was saying was that in the study, in the time when he did the study, he asked people through surveys what they thought about the economy and how they were doing personally. And it made no difference how they were doing personally. But depending upon how much media they consumed, if the media said things were bad, instead of looking in their own wallet, they reported what the media were telling them about the state of the economy. It's like if I saw you and I said, oh, I know you hurt your leg, how's your leg feel? And you said, well, I didn't watch Letterman last night, so I don't know. Okay? So that media sanction is so powerful that sometimes it makes us unable to speak. Another thing about cynicism that's interesting, it feeds on a particular kind of age anxiety. What that means is it makes young people feel older and adult. And it makes older people feel young and cool. And so it's a universal language that everybody can speak and feel better about themselves as a result. It also helps us avoid censure. I have presented this option to my undergraduates now for over 20 years in class. And I said, I will give $20 to any of you who will use this potential pickup line on a Thursday night, which is when people go drinking in Austin, on a Thursday night, regardless of gender. And here it is. You have to just say this to someone. If you say it to someone, you get $20. All right, here's the pickup line. I feel good to be alive in 2010. The threat of nuclear war seems low. The economy is gradually improving. We're beginning to accommodate a multicultural society. People are taking better care of their health. Seattle Seahawks are 4-2, want to go to the movies. 22 years I have offered $20. How many people have taken me up on it? 0. Why? That's the great question. I asked them, why? Would you try it? Exactly. And you probably can't tell me why. Because it would be so dorky to go in there and I say, wait a minute, everything here is really nice. It's a good thing. Don't you want other people to think that the world is good and that you could make a common bond of some sort, even temporary? Why wouldn't we do that? Because you'd have to not sound like Jon Stewart, right? And how scary would that be, to not sound like Jon Stewart? So why is the rise in political cynicism? There's lots of studies to suggest why. A lot of it is just the amount of media we consume, the privatization of media, the poor economy, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that's interesting about political cynicism is that it feeds on the topic of motive. There is in each of us something I call the Spielberg instinct, and that is each of us wants to make movies. And the thing about motive that's interesting is that nobody can see it. Nobody has ever seen a motive in all of human history. So why do we talk about motives all the time? And we do it. I heard she didn't go out with him. Oh yeah? Why? He's not rich enough? Oh, is he in the wrong fraternity? Or has he got a history with other women? Women in this class could go like 4 days talking about why he wouldn't go out with her, and you don't have to know anything about anyone, because motive can constantly be talked about, and you don't have to have any facts at all. And that's what makes political cynicism so powerful. It's a constant attempt to get at motives underlying the things that are allegedly done. We see what politicians do, but we never know their motives. But that makes all of us experts about what politicians do because we can see their motives even though we can't see their motives. But it makes you an expert. I know why. Let's talk about why. Right? Gossip feeds on commentary about motives for people doing things that we can see them doing and don't know why. And so that makes political cynicism a constant source of entertainment for all of us. And it's always documentable because we know that it's there even though we can't see it. Give me a few facts, not to be confused with the more superb facts you've already gotten. In general, watching a political speech makes a person twice as negative as seeing it in person. This is a study done by Wolf Donsbach, and it's been replicated now in a number of places. The study is very simple. This half of the room, you send them out and so I want you to go watch a political speech outside the building. This half of the room, I want you to watch that same speech on television. Without knowing anything else, you can bet that this group is going to be twice as negative about that speech as the group that actually saw it in person. It's as if the medium is sending cues to you to say, okay, now is the time to get negative, because that's the cool way of being as a media consumer. In general, the more we watch television, the less we know about current affairs. That's total amount of television, not selective news. Total television watching, the less you know about current affairs. In general, the more you depend on television news, the less you know about the news of the day. In general, the more we watch television, the surer we are about politicians. You know less, and you're more sure of what you don't know. In general, the more you watch politicians on television, the more you dislike them. In general, people who watch more strategy coverage are less inclined to vote. And this is the most important thing of all. If you forget everything I've said, but remember one thing, people react to the news as if it were representational rather than exceptional. They react to the news as if it were representational rather than exceptional. If you figure out what the news is, it's stuff that doesn't happen very often. That's why they call it the news. So, you look, there are 535 members of the House and Senate. One scandal gets on television, and you say to yourself, what do you say to yourself? I told you, they're all a bunch of crooks. It's exactly wrong. The only reason the scandal was reported is because it diverges from the other things that the 534 other people are doing. There are over 50,000 Catholic priests in the United States. It takes one person to be a child molester, and that paints with the broad brush of everyone. There are over 57,000 investment bankers in the United States at major corporations. It takes very few of them to create a scandal, and we read about it all the time. So the mathematics of cynicism are deplorable, completely deplorable. I tell my students that when you see a traffic accident reported in the news, you ought to feel good about it. And they'll say, what are you, crazy? Why would I want to feel good about a traffic accident? Because I say, can you imagine living in a society in which traffic accidents occurred so frequently that they didn't make the news? That would be a scary society. So when you see things in the news that are very, very worrisome to you, it, by definition, does not represent the norm. It represents a deviation from the norm. And therefore, when you see corruption exposed in the media, you say, gosh, isn't it great we live in a society in which people, by and large, adhere to the rule of law. All right, it's time to end. 10 ways of sleeping well tonight. And I know a lot of you have trouble sleeping. Here are the 10 answers. Presume that everything you read in the newspaper is the exception rather than the rule. 2, love politicians, they're our only option. 3, laugh with people, not at them. 4, get a lot of sleep because hope takes work. Don't buy any book containing the phrase crisis of democracy. Don't watch Jon Stewart, Bill Maher, or Stephen Colbert. Act your age. If you're young, think about the possibilities in front of you. If you're older, think about the wonders you've witnessed. 9, don't talk about people's motives. You don't know what you're talking about. And 10, and most important of all, when you talk about politics, talk about it as if there were a 9-year-old overhearing you. Thank you.